How can we make Europe great again? In the year 2000, the European Union had a nominal GDP 70% the size of the USA, 6 times that of China, and 15 times the size of India. It would proceed in the 2000s to catch up with the United States before the great financial crisis. By the year 2026, the EU is closer to being half the size of the United States economy, is roughly at parity with China, and is only 4 times the size of India. And even that lead is expected to shrink drastically over the coming decades. Now, the EU might be smaller than all 3 of those economies in the year 2050, but anything can happen. The United States might have a civil war, China might have a demographic collapse, India might stagnate for lack of adaptability to energy challenges. But some kind of disaster might befall Europe as well, not to mention the demographic collapse on its hands. So it's safe to assume that if today's trend continues, which it most likely will, Europe will be a drastically smaller economy than the other 3 by the year 2050. Now, while most people compare Europe and the United States, I don't think this is an appropriate comparison. While people like to call the United States the melting pot of the world, it is actually a largely homogeneous, English-speaking country that is mostly unified. For this, of course, they have to thank the fact that most of the natives died of disease, and then one cultural core, the English, settled the United States and could spread across such a vast continent. The United States doesn't have issues of cultural separatism the way that Europe does. And no, California wanting to leave the United States because they dislike Trump doesn't count. It doesn't count in the same way as Germany wanting to let Greece fall into a debt spiral because bailing Greece out would be a violation of the German constitution, which is separate from that of Greece. This is what makes the European Union so weird. The EU has, in contrast to the USA, multiple peoples, ethnicities, each of whom are very proud of their history, especially their recent history, and many of whom still speak their native languages, are very proud of those native languages and cultures, and they resist the federal superstate project that is the European Union. This is not really the case in the United States. Yes, on an administrative level, people resist the power of the federal government over the states, but they all share one constitution, and most people in the United States are not in favor of disintegrating the very project of the United States. Now, when you tell most Europeans about your trip in Europe, they might respond with, "Europe is not a country." To which my response is often, well, maybe it should be. And that's the thesis for today's video. We're going to delve into concrete examples of where the European Union as an institution fails and how Europe unifying its federal system into something more like a nation state would be beneficial for its future. Shout out to a Patreon subscriber, the first one ever, David Lucas, who says, "You live in Europe. I would like to see your input on how we can make Europe both more stable, more wealthy, and how it can be a counterbalance against the US and a source of global stability and development instead of doing everything the US wants." Thank you, David, for subscribing and for being my first subscriber. And I think this is a really important question to tackle, which is why I've spent the last few weeks researching this very question. We're going to compare Europe not to the United States today, because as I mentioned, they're 2 very different entities, but to India, which is also my domain specialty. Now, before we get caught up on the fact that India is today much poorer and messier and less well-governed than the EU, all of those things are true, I think the space that India occupies in the world is much more akin to that of the European Union than the European Union is to the United States, socio-politically speaking, not economically speaking. And importantly, militarily speaking, the European Union is moving closer to what India's position in the world is, where India is surrounded by hostile powers. The European Union might also have Russia on one side and the United States on the other. And we'll have to learn things about how to grow an independent military from a country like India. India also has multiple peoples, multiple ethnicities, all of whom are fiercely proud about their ethnicity in contrast to other ones, who mostly speak their own language and who have good reasons to resist the Indian Union superstate project. By and large, today, Indians, the vast majority of them, do not resist the Indian superstate project. They accept that this is a country, a normal country, and that they need to work together despite their differences to make it grow. Any disagreement that Indians have comes mostly now from disagreeing with the policies of the central government, not with the existence of the central government itself. The EU, on the other hand, has multiple extremely popular, fast-rising political far-right parties, many of whom either want to currently or have very recently wanted to remove their nation states from the EU. The AfD, the largest political party in Germany today and fastest growing by a huge margin, wants to do a Dexit, a Deutsch exit. And they want Germany to join instead a much softer institution that they call, wait a second, Wirtschafts- und Interessengemeinschaft. Very classic German long name. In France, Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party dropped their Frexit strategy. They used to have one, but their alternative isn't much better. They want to remain, but to refuse to comply with Brussels orders, which would make the European Union largely an ineffective institution. Her party has 20.5% of the seats in the French parliament. So these are not parties that you can ignore, even though the mainstream in both Germany and France does ignore these parties. Even in other countries where nationalist parties used to have an European exit strategy, they may have walked back on it, but the political pressure is still there. For example, in Italy, you have the Fratelli d'Italia. Until they got power, they were going for an Italian exit, but once they got power, they walked back their statements because they know what a disaster this would be for Italy and probably also for the European Union. Now, even though they may have flipped, and the AfD might do this, and Marine Le Pen might do this as well, the reality is that the fact that these parties are growing so fast and that they're coming to power means that there is a very real disenfranchisement with the European Union at a popular level in the EU, and it is growing in the biggest countries of the EU, France, Germany, and Italy. If your party that you voted in doesn't do it, you vote for another, more extreme party that can do what you wanted them to do. This is the Donald Trump phenomenon. People had been voting for change for so long, finally they just voted for a wrecking ball and they don't care what that wrecking ball does. And to add, those parties that get to the top and then claim they don't want to leave the EU anymore, part of the reason they don't want to leave the EU is because of EU funding, which depends heavily on the German surplus economic core of the European Union, which isn't going to last much longer. Germany is about to, in the next 5 to 10 years, probably closer to 5, enter a demographic collapse, one of the largest in the world, where the bulk of their working age population will cross into retirement, and Germany is likely going to go from being a surplus state to a deficit state, which means the EU by its nature is a bunch of deficit countries with no ability to finance each other competing for EU funding. This could end the Union, but ending the European Union would, in my opinion, be a disaster for individual nation states of the European Union and, of course, for the institution as a whole, because it would be dead. As unified political entities like China, India, Russia, or the United States push their elbows against each other in an increasingly unstable 21st century, and nobody is predicting this is going to get more stable. Everybody is predicting that this century is on its way for greater instability, greater competition, greater scarcity of resources. As Europe slips in global economic power rankings, how is it going to compete with these countries? How is it going to compete with a ravenously hungry United States that wants to swallow Greenland, Russia that wants to move into Eastern Europe, and India that is growing in the Indian Ocean, which wants to be a partner with the EU, but if the EU breaks apart, this is going to become extremely difficult to do. And of course, China, the country that may or may not surpass the United States as the financial hegemon of the world. The EU as a unified entity can dance with the big boys, but the EU separated into different nation states, it's going to be like the Peloponnesian Wars, where Persia, a hegemon sitting to the east of the Greek city-states, paid one state to fight another and keep each of them in a perpetual state of war so that they didn't bother Persia. This could happen to the EU if it breaks apart. You might have Russia supporting a few states, the United States supporting a few of them, China supporting a few of them, and perhaps even India supporting a few of them. And of course, there'll be overlap between these different powers competing for influence and resources in Europe. This would be a disaster. And to think that individual European countries can do a good job of fending off these powers is ridiculous. So this is where we start the first difference between the EU and India. In India, secession is a crime under the Constitution of India, which everyone agrees to. This is enforced by a unified military. So any state in India that wants to leave the Union of India will get put down, that rebellion will get put down to the betterment of the entire Union by the Indian military. While you might think this sounds so archaic because in Europe everyone is so progressive that they've moved beyond the need for a military to keep your country together, which everyone's realizing now was a mistake, this keeps the net union as a whole safer, more stable, more financially powerful, and able to tackle the challenges of the world. In Europe, by contrast, by Article 50 of the European Union, any country can just decide to leave the Union. That is insane. And the UK did. And we can see that for the UK, that was a disastrous decision. They're still dealing with a recession that they've hit since then. And for the European Union, it's taken out one of the heavy hitters of the Union. Also a disaster. It hasn't worked out for anybody, and many people in the UK now regret that decision. If the EU had a constitution and a military to enforce that constitution, the UK would never even have put the question on the table, do we need to leave the EU? Because everyone's just like, look, there's so much institutional structure embedded in the UK remaining in this constitutionally unified country that there's just no point even asking this question, except if you want to piss someone off or make content about it. Europeans think Hungary's Orban blocking their initiatives around Ukraine was bad. That is nothing compared to the disaster that would befall the EU if countries start leaving it, especially big countries like France, Germany, or Italy at the core. And yes, there are conversations being had about this. Let's take a moment to study how the EU functions, or doesn't, depending on who you ask. The EU, much like India, has a parliament with 705 members, and these members are elected directly by the citizens of the EU. So far, so good. Democratic representation, great. But whereas in India, the parliament itself, the democratically elected members of the parliament, have the power to propose laws and then review them and pass them through. This is the executive power of the country. In the European Union, the members of parliament don't actually have this power. How laws are proposed is a convoluted process to say the least, and let's break down the institution that is the European Union. First, each national leader of the EU, 27 of them, make up the European Council. So this is like France's Macron, Germany's Merz at the time of this recording. These national leaders, each of whom represents an independent constitution, independent country, independent military, think up the vision for the EU. So this is like a high school project, right? They all get together, they all have a vision, but it's going to be messy and there's going to be lots of disagreements, but whatever, it's not your main priority anyway, because your main priority is your country. They then elect, between the 27 of them, a European Commission president. And there's also a European College of Commissioners, whom must be approved by the democratically elected European Parliament, which is another separate entity. So we're at 3 entities already within the EU. Once you get the European College of Commissioners and their president, and this has been approved by the European Parliament, their term of 5 years begins. And only they, the College of Commissioners, can propose new laws, which then have to get reviewed by the European Parliament. And the European Parliament has the power to reject or approve those laws, but not to propose them itself. Finally, there's a dynamic body with no permanent members called the Council of the European Union, where there are 27 seats, but those seats are occupied by a rotating basis of all the finance ministers of each of the countries, then all the foreign ministers, all the energy ministers, whoever is relevant for a particular topic that the EU discusses. They gather the 27 independent ministers of that thing from each of the countries of the European Union. And they also have the expertise and ability to approve or reject legislation, which, in case we forgot, came from the European Commission, who was elected by the European Council, but approved by the European Parliament. If all this sounds convoluted to you, it's because it is, and it has real effects on the efficiency of the political body that is the European Union. A 2024 dataset analyzing laws revealed that the median duration for the standard ordinary legislative procedure is 537 days. For deeply social or economic issues, the entire machinery can get choked up for a decade or more. One example is the EU's Gender Balance on Company Boards Directive took 3,675 days. That's more than 10 years for the initial Commission proposal to final publication. India, by contrast, a prime minister with a majority in parliament can propose and pass new laws in a matter of days. Even massive contentious changes, like the goods and services tax, first taking years of political horse trading, was finally proposed and passed in a matter of 1 month, once the central government put its weight behind it. This difference in speed is the difference in the ability of your country to think as an organism on the world stage. Think of it like an environment where you have teams playing sports. One team has the agility to think and pass and make moves in a much shorter turnaround time. The other decides to debate what they're going to do and move accordingly in the middle of the game. It's usually the team that can move faster that's going to win. Doesn't quite boil down to something as simple as this, but you get what I'm trying to say. The nimbleness and agility of your entity on the international stage has meaningful effects on how you're going to grow, how you're going to compete, and how you're going to protect yourself. Coming back to India. In India, the executive branch, that being the prime minister and his or her chosen cabinet, is born directly out of the legislative majority elected by the people. So there's the parliament, and they put forward the prime minister. Furthermore, India has an anti-defection law in the constitution, meaning that the party of the acting government has to vote in favor of laws proposed by the leadership, which prevents internal party rebellion once a government is in power. Coming back to the EU, in case we forgot, the executive branch, the commission that proposes the laws, is independent of the legislators, not born out of it. Furthermore, there is no ruling party across all three bodies that they have, because each of these bodies have different bases of support. You have the council, which is national leaders who are voted via their own democratic processes. Most of the time, the democracies are working pretty well. Then you have the parliament, who are voted for people voting for the EU parliament specifically and separately. And then you have the commission, who are not even elected. They're just chosen by the leaders of the countries and then voted in by the parliament. And each of these bodies have their loyalties to different constituencies, and they have no reason to pass through laws or approve things. But aside from the structural issues, it gets even worse. In India, ordinary laws require a simple majority, 51% of the members of parliament. In the EU, they have something known as a qualified majority vote. Here's where the EU becomes especially incompetent. In matters regarding long-term budgeting, direct taxation, or citizenship and social protection, or foreign policy or security policy, arguably the most important aspects of being a geopolitical entity on the world stage, the EU requires a unanimous decision from both European Council, that's the national leaders, and the Council of the European Union, that's the rotating 27 ministers. This means that for anything regarding those important topics, any one country with national interests different than the other 26 countries can hold the entire EU hostage until that country extracts whatever demands it has from the European Union, and perhaps never conceding at all. This is not the case in India or any other democratic country, where no one party can veto a decision made by the majority, especially on matters like long-term budgeting, national security, foreign policy. Nobody can hold up the organism from carrying out its duties. And so what do we get in the end with the convoluted system that is the European Union? It can only operate as an entity by tackling low-hanging fruit and commissioning thousands of pages of bureaucratic law, and then amending it to death in order to get the parliamentary votes that they need. And guys, that isn't even the end of the story. In India, when a law is passed, it's immediately implemented to the entire country and is legally enforceable by a shared police system. In the EU, when a directive is finally passed, each national government is individually responsible for signing their own versions of that law into their national law. And because there are fines associated with not complying with the European Union, they often put even more bureaucracy on top of the European Union's proposed law, and they over-implement it because Brussels has legal authority over these countries. So they make the laws even stricter, but different versions, because they're all trying to interpret the EU's law in their own way, relevant to their own national systems. They implement different versions of that into their own countries, leading to the over-regulated bureaucratic miasma that businesses complain about in the EU, leading to low EU growth. They're kind of stagnating at 0% for the last 10, 15 years. But don't just take it from me looking at the entire structure. Let's look at concrete examples of where the machinery of the European Union fails. We'll look at 3 examples: defense cooperation, the COVID response, and the refugee crisis. France and Germany have recently cancelled a 6th-generation joint fighter program. The program was officially launched 9 years ago in July 2017 by Emmanuel Macron and former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. It was hailed as the crown jewel of European defense integration, designed to keep Europe technologically independent of both the United States and China. The jet was designed to fly alongside AI-controlled swarming drones, all linked together by a high-speed, secure battlefield data network called the Combat Cloud. So where did negotiations stall, and why did the deal fall through? The program ultimately died due to a fatal combination of corporate ego and irreconcilable military requirements. Firstly, the 2 prime contractors, France's Dassault Aviation and Germany's Airbus, spent years locked in a bitter dispute over the intellectual property and design. Dassault demanded absolute control over the flight software and cockpit design, viewing themselves as Europe's premier fighter architects, which they are. Germany demanded a strict 50-50 partnership to protect its own domestic engineering jobs and tax contributions. France's military architecture requires a fighter jet that can take off from aircraft carriers, because France is a naval power, one of the best ones in the world, and operates multiple aircraft carriers around the world. France also had a requirement that these jets were able to carry France's nuclear weapons. France is a nuclear-armed state, Germany is not. Nor is Germany a naval power. Berlin required a highly specialized long-range conventional attack bomber. Trying to engineer a single airframe to do both of those became prohibitively expensive and structurally impossible for the jet itself. The 2 countries do plan to salvage the Combat Cloud secure data network under the FCAS banner, but the actual joint fighter component is dead. Now, if France and Germany, and maybe even a bunch of other countries, were part of one country with a unified constitution, none of this would have been a problem. They would have been a nuclear country with aircraft carriers, and the requirements for the jet would also be joint because they're protecting the same country. Instead, Germany will likely continue to buy off-the-shelf American or British jet technology, and France will be left floundering without funding, unable to make a 6th-generation fighter. Let's look at the next way in which the structure of the European Union and its member states crumbles under pressure. That was with the pandemic response. This showed how European countries will collectively abandon weaker member states the moment a severe crisis hits. When northern Italy became the global epicenter of the pandemic in March 2020, its healthcare system collapsed. Rome activated the EU's civil protection mechanism, begging neighboring European Union countries for emergency medical supplies, masks, and PPE equipment. Not a single European Union member state responded to Italy's initial cries for help. Instead, they panicked over domestic supplies. Germany, France, and the Czech Republic immediately banned the export of protective medical gear, locking down their resources within their own borders. Simultaneously, Austria, France, Germany unilaterally shut down their borders with Italy, completely suspending the Schengen border-free zone overnight without consulting the European Union. Italy was left completely isolated, forced to rely on emergency medical planes flown in by, get this, China and Russia, while its European Union neighbors looked inward for protection. Europe as a unified nation state wouldn't be able to do such a thing because of domestic political pressures to protect everyone in the Union. They would be forced to save their states to do what's best for the collective. This illustrates further how the very structure of the EU as an entity allows nation states to act selfishly to the detriment of all. India, by contrast, the moment COVID cases came in, the entire country got together in order to make vaccines and supplies so that as a union, we could tackle that problem. And get this, poor India ended up being a massive donor of COVID vaccines around the developing world when the European Union was only turned inwards. Let's throw in one more example, the 2015 refugee crisis. When over 1 million migrants crossed the Mediterranean, frontline states like Greece and Italy were structurally overwhelmed due to an EU rule stating that refugees must be processed in the countries that first received them in the European Union. Now, they were abiding by EU law, and so they begged for mandatory continent-wide relocation quotas to distribute that burden of processing these refugees. Eastern European nations, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, just flatly refused to comply. They were like, we don't want these people, which is fair, but their national priorities were overruling that of the European Union. The European Union, as a unified nation state, might even decide in quicker time that they didn't even want the refugees in the first place or how to process them and send them on their merry way. Rather than coordinating a unified European border strategy, individual nations, including Austria, Hungary, and Slovenia, unilaterally, without consulting Brussels, built razor wire fences along their internal European borders to keep migrants trapped in the neighboring states. Because the EU is so slow to make policy, nation states naturally take the law into their own hands. Finally, we can't talk about why the European Union is broken without speaking about the ECB, the European Central Bank, the financial arm of the EU. In India or a normal country, the Reserve Bank and the central government work in tandem. If one region falls behind due to a drought or some kind of economic disaster, the entire country can pool resources together with the local government in order to get that region back on its feet, which is, again, usually better for the whole. In the Eurozone, this is not the case. The ECB has only one mandate, that is to maintain price stability of inflation at around 2%. And while they have secondary objectives to actually support growth and employment in their member countries, if it comes down to a choice between inflation and those other things, the ECB is legally mandated to choose keeping inflation down. And what this leads to is richer nations in the EU routinely sacrificing smaller ones in order to protect themselves, but that actually makes the problem worse for everybody. Let me give you a couple of examples. During the Eurozone crisis, you had Spain and Ireland's property sectors burst. Local banks in those countries had billions in non-performing loans because there was no European treasury. Remember, Europe is not a country, as Europeans will remind you. So it's on the national governments of each European country to manage their own treasuries with no obligation to have a shared treasury. So when Spain and Ireland's property bubbles collapsed, it was on their individual respective national treasuries to fix the problem. And so, of course, they bail out their local banks because what are you going to do? Let your country go into a Great Depression? But remember, they can't print their own money because the printing press is with the ECB. And so they had to issue sovereign bonds, borrowing money from foreign countries at international bond rates in order to save their own countries. The risk of not being able to print their money made the interest rates on their international bonds more expensive, which increased their risk of not being able to pay them back, which further pushed up interest rates. This is called a doom loop. Okay, another example. Get this. During the Greek financial crisis, the spread on borrowing rates between Germany, one of the healthier countries in the EU, and Greece, at that time a financially collapsing country, was 30%. That means if you want to get a 10-year bond in Germany, you had to pay, I think it was 1 or 2%, and if you wanted to get one in Greece, you had to pay upwards of 30%. It was only when the doom loop got worse and the financial contamination spread to France and Italy, who were then also on the brink of falling into a debt spiral, that Mario Draghi, the new ECB president, famously declared that the central bank would do whatever it takes to save the euro.
There's another message that I want to tell you today, is that within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough.
Because if these countries all financially collapse, the euro is dead. So he acted as a backstop to save the eurozone before it collapsed like a row of dominoes. The reason why the ECB only did this so late, guaranteed that they would bail out their member countries, is because how the ECB works is also quite convoluted. It has a board of 6 executives plus 20 governors of the national banks of each European country. Now, in case you remembered, there are 27 national banks in the EU. And you're thinking, hey, 20 seats, 27 national banks, that doesn't match up. You'd be right. They keep the number of governors of the ECB to 20 on a rotational basis to avoid bloating of decision-making in the organization. Yet another strange workaround for a somewhat strange organization. Draghi could only finally push forward his reforms when France, Italy, and the Netherlands, which previously was financially conservative, but then they got freaked out and said, okay, let's bail out Greece, or else the euro itself will collapse, which is terrible for all of us. Germany's central bank governor, Jens Weidmann, was opposed to the bailout the entire time, arguing that it goes against the German constitution for Germany to bail out other countries without the German parliament approving that decision, because this is German taxpayer money at the end of the day. And he wasn't wrong. If we're following the German constitution, he's right. That is constitutionally illegal in Germany. The problem is that Germany's constitution takes precedent over the needs of the European Union as a whole. Let's contrast this with how normal countries with central banks manage these problems. Let's look at how the Indian Union, when its states face economic shock, how it handles it. Now, India avoids a doom loop via 3 mechanisms. 1, there's national bank insulation. So when one local bank in a state fails, the national central bank makes sure that liquidity flows into the state so that it doesn't spread to other local banks and eventually to other states as well, like it did in Europe. So nobody's worried that they won't be able to get money out of an ATM in that state. Number 2, the RBI compresses the yield spread. Remember how we looked earlier about how the difference between Germany and Greece's 10-year bond yields was more than 30%? In India, the RBI makes sure it never crosses 1%, so you don't get one region trying to economically punish another. States are never pushed into a doom loop of borrowing at international bond rates. 3, the central government in India generally redistributes money from more developed states to less developed ones. This acts as an economic stabilizer. Now, like me, you might think at first, wait, so isn't that kind of unfair that richer regions and people in India pay for the bad behavior and debts of poorer regions in India? And you'd kind of be right if punishing those debtors worked. In the European Union, for example, when Germany was punishing Greece and Spain and Ireland from living beyond their means compared to the fiscally prudent Germans, it's not like this ended up fixing the Eurozone's problems. It just cascaded into a worsening debt situation, made things worse for everybody, and the EU has been struggling with 0% growth ever since. You might be thinking, can't we just let the markets act naturally? But the thing is, the problem with this is that markets acting naturally can actually cause phenomena like the doom loop, which are as much driven by investor sentiment as they are with fundamentals. So much of economics and finance is just how people feel. It's the vibes in the air. In the European Union, after the financial crisis, Greece lost 25% of its GDP, and the Eurozone stagnated ever since. In India or the US, even if there are shocks or a financial crisis, it was never bad enough for the system to completely freeze or drop out of the game entirely. In Europe, Spain and Greece faced mass youth unemployment upwards of 50%, which caused mass migrations of young people from Spain and Greece north to countries like Germany. In India, local public services and infrastructure are subsidized in the poorer regions, which preserves the local economy and doesn't create these disastrous movement situations as well. In Europe, every financial crisis leads to the question of whether the Eurozone itself will survive the crisis. which isn't a great question to be asking for a region that wants to compete in great power competition around the world. In India, while the rupee is devalued over time, this is never a question. Will the Indian Union survive? Perhaps the only advantage, if you can even call it that, of the European system is that it forces every nation state within Europe to act more prudently because they know the punishment that's coming for them if they don't. Now, the ECB has learned from its mistakes. They now have the TPI, the Transmission Protection Instrument, which is pre-approved permission to step in and buy a nation's bonds if they need to get out of a speculative spiral. The ECB also tried a unified debt project during the post-pandemic recovery that they could well use as a template for future European debt. But while these patch over glaring weaknesses, it doesn't change the fact that the European Union and the ECB are made up of 27 individual nation states with their own individual national priorities and constitutions and federal treasuries. The underlying structure remains a union of separate governance, so that at the foreign policy, economic, finance, and military levels, the EU is left as a bureaucratic, clunky mess that's operating far from its actual potential, only because it doesn't have the political will to unify as a country. And in fact, it's even worse. Its biggest parties are talking about leaving the Union. Think about the potential that the European Union has. Think about the level of education, the population size, the culture, the arts, the diversity, the magnetism as a region. It's one of the best places on earth to live in, that's for sure. And it's letting it all go to waste for national pride. It's during times like this where I feel that the future of India 3-4 generations down the line is going to look far more positive than the ground realities in the European Union at that time if it's unable to tackle the challenges that are coming its way. The European Union has a rich history. It wasn't colonized recently by any large power and had no reason to unify against that external threat. And this success of recent history is cursing the European Union to actually believe that it can survive in the world going forward without unifying. So in my view, Europeans should seriously consider the questions posed by Yanis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister who pleaded unsuccessfully to get Germany to bail Greece out of its financial crisis. We have walked this path towards a particular union, however toxic it might be. And if we try to step back from it, we are going to fall off a cliff. Its fragmentation brought about apocalyptic human losses in the 1930s, and I very much fear that we would have the same thing now. It remains to be seen whether the European Union will choose the smart path, or whether it does retreat into its national cocoons, familiarity and safety, to face a new world as weaker, more divided powers, which somehow is a choice that people in the European Union are still debating. Only time will tell. Thanks for your time.